sorry. We need to learn to think critically and to wrestle with deeper questions than the ones that are most often asked. Nothing is black and white, nothing is good or bad. We need to be willing to wrestle with complexities, nuances, the various shades of gray, and to be willing to do so within our own context, thoughts and ideas. And I think sometimes Christians don't like to engage too much. We like to remain very conservative in the way that we think. But I was listening to Elaine earlier on. It's just a case that we can't do that. There's so many nuances. There's so many things that, as a church, as missionaries, or whatever it might be, within our sphere of influence, that we have to engage with. The world is changing, and the questions that they are asking us are very different to maybe even the answers that we have, and we don't like the change, but we have to engage with it. And so I just want to just give a brief description of what I would consider Islamophobia. And this is according to the Runnymede Trust as anti-Muslim racism. Our longer definition is based on the UN definition of racism that the UK government has signed up to for over 50 years. So this is the quote: Islamophobia is any distinction, exclusion, or restriction towards or preference against Muslims or those perceived to be Muslims that has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. This is strong terminology, but I want to point it out as the words are integral. This word Islamophobia is integral to the political and public discourse. It is something now that we have to relate to, we have to respond to. And there is power in naming things. Often strong terminology, as I've said before, makes us uncomfortable or offensive or defensive. They might reveal something about ourselves, which we don't always want to acknowledge. So what I wanted to do is just spend a little bit of time. There's 4 features of Islamophobia or misnomers that we need to think through. Some of them are taken by Todd Green's book, Islamophobia, and he talks about a closed view. And I like that because we have a very closed or narrow view of things. And so the first thing I want to kind of highlight is Islam as a monolithic and static. That Islam lacks diversity and internal differences or disagreements. All Muslims are the same. They hold the same uniform worldview and ideology. This is, again, reinforced by media coverage that focuses on violence and terrorism in the name of Islam. Therefore, it is safe to say that all Muslims are prone to violence and agree with jihad. And this is something that I loved what Bert was talking about earlier, is that when we think about Islam, we don't think about its diversity. As in Christianity, the spectrum of our theology, the spectrum of how it is seen or represented goes from Greek Orthodox all the way to evangelical expressions. And in the same way, Islam has the same diversity. And we don't really often see that. We just see a very sort of formal, uniformed way. So this is something that I thought was quite interesting. The commonly held belief that women who wear, say, for instance, the hijab or the burqa, it's a sign of oppression. This was quite interesting. I was listening to the debates. So France had their presidential candidate debates a couple of days ago with Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. And she said something that was really interesting. So she said, Le Pen promised to tackle Islamic extremism with a new law and called for, and this is what she said, republic that is proud of itself and not ashamed. Right? Radical mosques has had to be closed, and those migrants considered a security risk should be deported. She said, I am for the banning of the headscarf in the public space. It is a uniform imposed by Islamic extremism. This is incredible that even, like I say, that in the political domain and in the public space, these are very real statements. And she is actually just making a statement of what is already out there. But if you think that this is a presidential candidate who's making that statement, how much more power those words will have on the streets. But yet, we don't really think through that it would be the same as addressing a Catholic nun's habits, because that is an expression. And so what would the difference be? So these are the kind of things that we need to begin to think through. Is it that as Muslim, they're guilty by association in the discourse found in the West? All Muslims are terrorists. The rhetoric we believe as it is reinforced. And these things are reinforced through media, through the things that we read, and even in our own discussion. I was asked about, it was just after 9/11, at a church, I was in the States, and because I'm a woman, I wasn't allowed to preach, but they asked me to lead a adults Bible study, which I thought was quite fun, because basically everyone got up, got coffee, and went and sat down again. And but before that, I was part of the service, and this was being recorded. And the person that was speaking said, all Muslims are terrorists and unredeemable. And I can't sit through things comfortably. So I always have to write things down. And as I was writing, I thought, did he actually just say that? I looked around and people were like nodding their heads. And I thought, this is not just here, people listening to this, this is being televised. And if this is coming from the church, I was pretty horrified, because they'd asked me to speak on Islam afterwards at the adults Bible study. And so I thought I would start with the story of Ishmael and circumcision. That didn't go well. And needless to say, they didn't ask me to speak again. But I was quite interested as to some of their thought processes with some of the questions that they asked me. And I did think, why actually did you ask me? And I got the feeling at the end they wanted me to just reinforce what was already understood. And that was something that was really heartbreaking for me. And I understand that this 9/11 had just happened. And so there was a sensitivity that I wanted to also walk in, but I also wanted to reinforce that this isn't correct. So that was quite interesting. And then when I was in the Middle East, I was learning Arabic. And my Arabic teacher kept on saying to me that Islam is an evil religion with an evil book. And he would reinforce this over and over and over again. And I thought, at the end of the day, we need to find ways to engage, as opposed to what we don't have in common. And this is how my love and my passion for Islam actually kind of started. Was I didn't see avenues of engagement. It was always what separated us, and not actually what brought us together. And I thought, okay, there has to be more that brings us together than actually that separates us. And so, yes, again, as I was saying earlier on, when we think of Islam, we don't think of them as being diverse. And I mean, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking, okay, there's two sects of Islam, and we're looking at Sunni and Shia. And then in the Sunni, we're looking at the four primary or mainstream schools of law. And that already is diverse. I mean, there's four, and from the four, you can actually get, I think, about 13 or 14, but there's four main ones. And so they have different thinking. The way that they look at the law, the way that they express how they live their lives is not always the same. And the wrestling that goes on, I think we have to take those into consideration, that it is really layered and there's a lot of nuance. So the second thing is Islam as a separate, and it is other. It is another misnomer that Islam shares none of the core values found in the other Abrahamic faiths. Primarily, we look at Christianity, or within what we understand as what people would call Western culture. And I have a problem with that terminology, because the West isn't a culture. The West is just an indication of place, of where it is. But we're talking about the values that respect religious diversity, or the freedom of religion. So what I mean by the term culture are the aspects that characterize the West. So I'm talking about democracy, or rational thinking, or individualism, Christianity, capitalism, modern technology, human rights, scientific thinking. And this is influenced by the Protestant Reform and the Enlightenment, which some spoke about earlier on. And these are the things that define who we are. And we think that actually we are embracing the diversity of religion. So I just want to read just a quote from Todd Green. He said, "The debate of the building of the minarets in Switzerland illustrates this perception. In 2009, the Swiss People's Party, a radical right party, led a campaign in Switzerland to prohibit the construction of new minarets, that is, towers located on or next to mosques. During a television interview, a reporter asked Ulrich Schüler, a member of the party and a major figure behind the anti-minaret campaign, if the proposed ban was fair, in light of the fact that it targeted minarets but not church steeples. Schlüter responded that the comparison was invalid because the steeples and the minaret represents two religions that hold two very different sets of values. And he said, I think Christianity is an attitude of freedom, of recognizing different meanings of tolerance. Islam has nothing to do with tolerance. But another way, Christianity embraces and epitomizes Western secular values, such as tolerance and freedom, the very value that Islam rejects. Since Islam is so different, so other, its symbols cannot be allowed to occupy public space and promote values that are foreign to the Swiss people." And I thought this was really interesting because we talk about this issue when it came up. This was something that we were wrestling with. And what it reveals is our own split thinking. If we talk about freedom of religion expression, are we allowing that? Are we doing that? And how much do we allow this with the encroachment of Islam in the West? What do we fear in this? The third thing is Islam is inferior. We take an ethnocentric view of the other. In comparison to the West, Islam is seen as backward thinking, barbaric, irrational, and sexist, while the West is considered forward thinking, innovative, enlightened, civilized, and emphasizes gender equality. And yet we have just listened to Elaine, and we see that is not always the case. And that actually, unfortunately, we're struggling with these very tensions ourselves. And so this is something that we need to begin to look at. Do we believe we're superior? And how do we treat people that sound and look different to us? I was chatting to a friend not so long ago about even how English is spoken. How do we judge people who speak with an accent? How do we view them? And we're constantly doing this. And again, it's about this idea of identity and this idea of belonging. And this stereotype view is often reinforced. And funny enough, it's reinforced by those that have been part of Islam. And one of the writers that I actually hold quite dear is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a Somali-born activist, feminist author. And she was one of the first to really bring this idea of what Islam as an oppressive religion to the sort of public domain. And she's an author, she's a scholar, she's actually a former Dutch politician and a former Muslim. And she was actually part of, I'm not sure if you remember, but there was a Dutch producer that was killed because of a film he made called Submission. And she was actually the actress, or she was part of that film. Actually, it never aired. And it was just this whole idea of violence against women and what the Quran says. And there was just a lot of controversy. And so she had a fatwa that was imposed on her. And so she really has experienced the very worst of it. But in her book, A Nomad from Islam to America, Personal Journey to the Clash of Civilizations, she wrote that Islam is incompatible with the principles of liberty that are at the heart of the Enlightenment legacy. And this was quite interesting to me. Again, this is a feeling where people are at, and their stories count and they matter. But often this rhetoric and this dialogue doesn't serve us. But we have to understand the pain pieces behind these dialogues. And again, just going back to the French presidential debates, Le Pen, she was more comfortable on her specialist subject, crime and insecurity. And she lamented the increasing barbarity, and she used that word, in the country and blamed it on, and I quote, anarchic and massive immigration. And she promised to rearm the police and toughen up the legal system, creating 25,000 extra prison places. And we are dealing with this kind of rhetoric of the other in our political discourse. And it is something that is constantly being reinforced. And so what happens is people fear the other. They fear what they don't understand. And we see that often. Could it be that the reason why Brexit worked and why it came about was because of the fear of the other? Some say yes, some say no, some say there was a lot more to it. But I wonder if the layers that we are looking at were not influenced by that. And then the fourth thing is Islam is the enemy. And I think for us as Christians, this is really important. And again, a lot of this comes from the tragic events of 9/11, that Islam is aggressive, violent, and hostile, that Muslims are called to jihad or kill the infidel, whilst the rallying cry in response was war on terrorism. And so here we have again the tensions that lie, that underline or underpin how we deal with the other. So this has had a huge impact on foreign and domestic policies and trickles down in the public spaces and how individuals are viewed with suspicion. So these are just some of the points that I wanted to highlight, and how much of that are we guilty of as Christians, and have we responded in similar ways, or even just in our thought processes, and what are we called to, and do we re-emphasize the us versus them mentality? And this is something that, for me, on a very personal level, I did experience when I was in the Middle East, and that's what prompted me to actually go and study Islamic law as in a master's degree, and looking at extremism and really wanting to understand at a deeper level why it is so important to understand what people believe and how their thinking is influenced from their culture, from their background. And it's painful, and it makes us vulnerable. And we recognize that there are so many things that we have to address. And it was just interesting when, again, I keep using Elaine. There were so many things that I was picking up, but we were looking at she just mentioned FGM, female genital mutilation, and yet a lot of that cultural understanding of it is perpetuated by women who had that done to them. And yes, and maybe in a patriarchal society, but it's perpetuated by women. And it's like, why is that? And to begin to understand that these women are not evil, but it's part of something that has always been part of their culture. And how do we break out of these things? And it's really important for us to begin to relate to and begin to really unpack. So just when Mark 12, 28, 34 says, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. We know this scripture. And in YWAM, it's a huge, we constantly emphasize that with the Great Commission: go and make disciples. In Matthew 22:40, Jesus continues to say, upon these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets. And so he's emphasizing something here, is how to love our neighbors. If we are to love God with everything that we are, and we are created in his image, and we are to love the other, the neighbor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, what is he saying? How do we walk in that? And so, yes, first we establish who God is, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we talk about the Trinity. We know these things. We talk about loving with our whole being, and it talks about who we are. It's an identity piece. Love the Lord your God with all of who you are. And we have our belonging in that. Love our neighbors. How do we live in community? So how do we build bridges of understanding? And this is something that is really important. I'd, like I said, I'd spent some time in the Middle East, and I found myself in a position of working with an incredible organization called B'Tselem. And we were ministering to a man that had been detained by the police, by the army, the Israeli army, and just because he was trying to actually get his daughter from school, but because of the annexing of parts of Jerusalem, he got caught, and of course he reacted, and they held him overnight, and the next day he came, and as we were talking to him and asking what had happened, he said to me, this chest is for Hamas. And I was so shocked by that. I was like, that he thinks that this is the way forward, was to join the sort of arm of a terrorist organization, or for others, what is a terrorist organization? For others, it is not so much. And I was really taken aback by that. What leads a person to get to that place where they're willing to die, to just be heard and understood? And I was with his mother, and she was just crying, and my Arabic was very minimal at that time, and I could just hold her, and the Lord just said, love her. And I was like, Lord, there must be more than that. We have to make changes, and we have to bring understanding. We have to look at vulnerability. We have to understand the marginalized. We have to be willing to walk with them. And it is difficult, and it is hard, especially when the cultures are so different and we feel so other. And so this was just something that led me to trying to understand a little bit more of a cultural religion that is different to myself and to Christianity, and to see how I could build bridges. And so this was something that I was really, really, it was a profound moment in my life to understand that even in the way that I dialogue, is my dialogue, even the way I talk about Islam, the way I talk about Muslim, is it prejudice? Am I reinforcing an anti-Islamic rhetoric? And this was so interesting with what Bert was talking about, is looking at interfaith dialogue, really learning to listen and to respect, and to not critique the person. It's okay to be able to, in trust and building relationships, being able to say, okay, well, let's unpack some of these thinking, as we should do within our own understanding and doctrines as well. And so this was just something that I wanted to just share. Just this evening, just something just quite quick. I know there's so many layers and there's so much more to it, but just this fear of the other that is really in our midst, not just as Christians, but in the public space, in our political discourses, and how we are engaging. So yeah, just a nutshell of fear of the other.